A female lead with a single intention of pursuing a career, a dual personality crazy criticism male lead, Lanxi has been reborn for a lifetime, but still has not escaped the entanglement of crazy criticism. At the age of only 22, Yiqin, the most powerful figure in the imperial capital, firmly held the top position of the Gu family group, using ruthless means. Wealth and power were merely played between the hands of shareholders. People only know that he has a cold and indifferent nature, and he seems to have no interest in anything. It is dignified and dignified, with a sense of detachment and moderation. No one knows that Yiqin is a lunatic with a dual personality. In his previous life, he locked her in a golden sparrow cage, and Lanxi endured 4 years before finally jumping off the balcony. After being reborn, she avoided him too much and only wanted to make a name for herself in art and design. Design competition, James Fabric, Cup, Prada Award in the painting industry, China Gaoding Fashion Week, Global Works Tour Whitney, a Chinese overseas art master, commented that an uncut jade is so perfect that it doesn't need to be carved. The first domestic high-end designer said to her, "You should be born for Oriental fashion." Su Xiu Master Gu Zhen said, "From the beginning of that Ru porcelain qipao, I knew where you had a connection with this needle and thread." Just as she felt like she had escaped fate and become a well-known Chinese high-end designer, Yiqin suddenly handed a painting to her. She looked down and her fingertips tingled. A painting of the back of a woman in a white dress under a hazy moonlit night was the last scene before her death in her previous life. Yiqin's eyes darkened and he said, "I dream of this scene every night. Can Miss Yan help me clarify this?" Lanxi's eyelids twitched several times and he said, I don't know, it's not me." Keywords of the novel. Indulging in indulgence. Chased by the sick and spoiled big shot, no pop-ups, indulging in indulgence. Chased by the sick and spoiled big shot, download the complete TXT collection and indulge in indulgence. Chased by a sick and spoiled boss to kiss, reading the latest chapter. Chapter 1. Moonlit Night. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1 Moonlit Night. I was reborn on the day I first met Yiqin. I pretended to be cowardly to avoid catching his attention and being imprisoned by him again. Unexpectedly, his second personality fell in love with me at first sight. His second personality stared at me with a sickly and obsessed gaze. Does Xiaoxi have to make me take measures to be willing? And later he chuckled softly in my ear, his tone eerie. You're afraid he'll go crazy, aren't you afraid I'll go crazy? I remember the way they crossed and went crazy in the previous life, with a splitting headache and a fear of not being able to avoid it. But he is paranoid and addicted, unwilling to let me go in this lifetime. The night fell low, the air was icy and piercing, and the mottled moonlight shone through the nailed screen window, shining on the chains at the end of the bed. Lanxi sat on the bed, staring at the cold reflection on the chain, lost in thought. It's really rare that he hasn't locked her up for a year, but unfortunately, he still can't get out of the villa door. A cold and strong breath of pine sandalwood suddenly invaded her, and her slightly cool fingertips climbed onto her spine. The man's cold, snowy voice slowly sounded. What are you thinking? The sound sounded as beautiful as the most perfect movement, but it made her shiver. She turned around and saw the man staring at her, with an undeniable desire for control in his eyes. The slightly sentimental and indifferent eyes slightly raised their tails, and despite being affectionate peach blossom eyes, their coldness was profound to the extreme. No one knows that Yiqin, the ruler of the Gu family in the imperial capital, who is known for his bland personality and fame, is a complete madman. And after being a caged canary for 4 years, it should be over. She remained silent for 3 seconds, then suddenly stepped forward and reached out her hand, covering the back of the man's hand with her soft and icy little hand. Yiqin's figure slightly froze for half a second. Ah Qin, today is Mid-Autumn Festival. I want to watch the moon with you. Her voice is soft and sweet, with a hint of coquettishness. She knows exactly what kind of appearance he likes. He stared at her clear eyes for a moment, then nodded, okay. He walked hand in hand with her to the balcony, and Yiqin's strength was neither light nor heavy, holding her in his arms, but he couldn't allow her to escape at all. He rubbed the ends of her hair. Under the moonlight, the man's stunning face was faintly visible, with a hint of tender heart. In a daze, she looked again, only to see those heavy and cold eyes regain a look of no sadness or joy. Yiqin. She called out to him softly, then turned her gaze to him and smiled, as if he had secretly peeked at him the year she first met. During these 4 years, she never laughed again. Yiqin's expression was momentarily dazed, with a fragrant fragrance gradually approaching, and a gentle and cool touch coming from the corner of his lips. She approached him so proactively for the first time without his coercion. His pupils slightly dilated, and in a moment of confusion, he wanted to say something, only to see the girl's dimples becoming increasingly bright, her smile sweet, but with a hint of terrifying warning. Suddenly, in the next second, the girl seemed to exert all her life strength to push him away from his stunned state, and jumped down from the balcony on the 5th floor with all her might. Like a broken butterfly, leaving no words. Fast as if in an instant, but long as if a lifetime has passed. The pure white corner of his clothes suddenly disappeared from his sight. Yiqin's face turned pale like paper, and the corners of his eyes turned red. He stumbled slightly and looked down from the balcony in a panic. Blood bloomed like evening roses all over this moonlit night. A smile that bloomed silently on the girl's lips, as if relieved. Lanxi quietly closed her eyes, not seeing the last scene. The man's eyes were shattered and crazy. Yiqin knelt down in front of the railing, the moonlight scattered and the world shattered in his eyes. All memories belonging to another personality are pouring in one after another. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Rebirth. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Rebirth. After an unknown amount of time, she felt that her consciousness was not extinguished but became increasingly clear, and there was a sharp pain in her mind for a moment. Kneel down and apologize. Otherwise, I guarantee you won't be able to leave this door today. Yes. Kneel down and apologize. Do you know how big a person you have offended? This bottle of wine costs 800,000 yuan, can you afford to pay for it? The noisy sound buzzed in her ears, and she covered her head and raised her eyes. A familiar yet unfamiliar scene. Drunk in paper and obsessed with gold, the first selling golden cave in the imperial capital known as the Night Lord. Blood coagulation. She didn't die, she was reborn. She was reborn on the day she first met Yiqin. She turned her face, where the shadows overlapped. The man sat on the sofa, his gaze lowered, his posture lazy, and indifferent. The handsome and cold facial features were depicted by light and shadow as a stunning picture, just like the first time she saw him. The astonishment of the past is now reduced to the fear of bone-attached gangrene. She immediately recalled the current scene. In her previous life, her best friend Mo Ren asked her to help deliver drinks to VIP luxury room 888 due to stomach pain. But accidentally spilled all the wine on his collar. The man was not angry, but his cold and indifferent eyes, as cold as snow, clearly had no emotions, yet made people feel like ants. At this moment, the icy and piercing liquid poured down from her head, interrupting her memories. It was those people, perhaps trying to curry favor with this esteemed man, with eyes full of ridicule, pouring the entire bottle of wine onto her head. She had a pale face, with trembling lips and teeth. She clenched her hand and let the wine wet her cheeks in embarrassment. The man's demeanor was aloof, and he didn't stop him in any way. I never said a word from beginning to end. Just like in the previous life. Watch with a cold eye. Back then, she would rather die than kneel, but what she got was those people driving her and forcing her to kneel. But the man, from beginning to end, looked indifferent to the side, like an outsider watching a farce that piqued his interest. Extremely bad. Without his tacit consent, how could those people be like this? He clearly acted as a scapegoat for the tiger and remained indifferent. She thought this matter would turn over after this day. But I didn't expect everything that happened afterwards to be a nightmare. On the ground, the broken glass slightly reflected light, and the wine on the ground emitted a fragrant fragrance, but it made her feel nauseous for an instant. There is a deep sense of determination and fear in her eyes. Starting over, she will inevitably stay away from that madman in this life, and never repeat the same mistakes again. She pursed her lips, suppressed her fear, and bowed respectfully to the man. Qin Yi, I really didn't mean to. I am willing to compensate for all the money, but if I can't afford it, I can pay in installments. I request Qin Yi to show my respect. If you insist on me kneeling, that's also acceptable. Gu Yiqin heard this humble apology and suddenly looked up at her. Under the dim light, the young girl was petite and small, with her head lowered. She could only see trembling eyelashes and a smooth forehead. The alcohol wet her hair, making her look very embarrassed. Just now, with a stubborn and unyielding appearance, suddenly became so witty. I don't know why, but he suddenly showed some interest. The man's fingers lightly caressed the corner of his lips, and the light tobacco curled up from the gap between his right finger. The cufflink spread out, inexplicably carrying a hint of coldness. He squinted his eyes and looked at her, not maliciously, but by no means well-intentioned. Qin Yi, look, the manager in charge boldly and cautiously asked. In the air, there was a moment of terrifying silence, as if waiting for the verdict of death. Gu Yiqin just looked at the young girl standing with her head down like a piece of wood, her back straight, as if she was on a first-level warning line. That's half the point. Under the gaze of everyone, the man flicked his cigarette ash lightly, his face as cold as jade, and his eyes tinged with a hint of interest. Okay, kneel down, 800000, offset it. Yan Lianxi's face remained motionless, but his lips were bitten with blood. This man who is inherently wicked, no matter how good his skin is, he cannot be saved. At this moment, the private door suddenly opened and Mo ran in. She looked at Yan Lianxi with concern and then knelt down. Qin Yi, everything is my fault. It's me asking my friends to help me deliver drinks, it's me leaving my job without permission. I'll just kneel down. Yan Lianxi's red eyes pulled at her, Mo remained motionless. That group of dogs spoke again. It's not you who splashed alcohol. Just make her kneel. Right. At first, she was quite stubborn and arrogant, so let her kneel down. Gu Yiqin remained silent, and even a faint smile appeared on his lips, inexplicably carrying a hint of malicious interest. Why are you staring at her? Yan Lianxi remembered that he had said that when he first met her, her gaze was very special, like a cat he had raised when he was a child, hiding a wild and rebellious nature that he wanted to tame. Later, gradually, this sudden rise evolved into a crazy desire for control. Under everyone's gaze, it seemed to be waiting for Yan Lianxi's reaction. In the next second, the petite girl suddenly knelt down uncontrollably. If this can calm Lord Qin down, I am willing to kneel. The girl's voice spoke word by word, her gaze fixed on the ground like a soulless puppet. He is lifeless. Gu Yiqin suddenly felt a slight loss of interest. He withdrew his indifferent gaze and waved his hand. The people of Yiju immediately bent down and bowed their backs to express their gratitude, while Yan Xuxi silently lowered her head and pulled Mo ran to follow the crowd out. I never looked at that person again from beginning to end. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Incomplete. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3 Incomplete. After leaving the Night Lord, the two of them breathed a sigh of relief like survivors. I'm sorry, it's all my fault. You shouldn't have helped me deliver drinks. The two of them walked side by side towards the station platform at the entrance of Yiju. Listening to Mo Rant's apology, Yan Jushi just shook her head and clenched her hand. "You're my best friend, what's that? It's just that I've caused you a lot of trouble." Mo Ran shook her head and said, "Fortunately, the matter has been resolved." Yan Lianqi nodded and said, "Well, although he said the compensation was waived, I still have to compensate him for the alcohol money." "But 800,000 yuan, where can we get so much money?" Yan Lianqi tightly grasped her hand, her expression somewhat indecisive and unpredictable. After a while, she suddenly spoke up. "I have a solution." In her previous life, she bored herself by reading many books and achieved remarkable results in professional painting. She had drawn many design manuscripts herself, but because of that man, her designs had never been published. At the age of 19, she only won the second place of the Prada Award with a piece of art, and became famous overseas. Her most respected overseas master Whitney threatened to take her as her apprentice, and her future was limitless. But later on, seemingly recalling terrifying memories, she gritted her lips and stopped reminiscing. She said to Mo Ran, who seemed to be joking, "Mo, let's open a clothing store online. I'll create a design draft and you'll sell and manage ready-to-wear clothes. It's better than working outside in the dust, and I believe in your abilities." Mo Ran studied economics and finance, and achieved career success in her previous life, only a few years later. Mo Ran gazed into Yan Lianqi's calm and clear eyes for a while and suddenly said, "I feel like you're a bit different from usual." "What's different?" Yan Lianqi smiled and said, "It's much calmer than usual." And according to the past, Yan Lianqi, whom I just met, would never kneel down in that situation. Yan Lianqi didn't speak, and there was a moment of confusion in front of him. Yes, at the age of 18, she was still a flower bud that had not weathered the wind and waves. However, after encountering Yiqin, she gradually withered and her fragile flower branches were broken, leaving only decaying and dilapidated fragments. She is no longer the same as before. Farewell to Mo Ran at the station, watching his friend get on the bus. As the bus gradually drove away, Yan Lianqi withdrew her gaze and saw a low-key and luxurious black business car parked across the road. The car window was tightly closed, and she couldn't see half of it inside, but it made her instantly raise the warning line and her hair stand on end. It's Yiqin's car, with a license plate number of 5 and 8. It's a license plate number that only the top elites in the imperial capital can afford, and when it turns into dust, she knows it all. Yan Lianqi's eyelashes trembled slightly, pretending to be calm and retracting his gaze. The man's indifferent and cold eyes flashed before her, but she had seen how crazy and beast-like colors had been dyed in these eyes. In her previous life, she was targeted by a madman due to her stubbornness and arrogance. As if treating her as a plaything in a game, tormenting her self-esteem and destroying her personality. And later on, the gentle whispers that whispered in the ears late at night were like devil's spells. Her fingers trembled with fear, and she lowered her head to hide herself. From a distance, she looked so ordinary in the crowd that she couldn't be more ordinary. At this moment, someone beside her suddenly accidentally bumped into her, causing her to stumble and fall to the ground. Didn't she have long eyes? The obese woman who knocked her down first complained, seeing her thin and weak appearance, and loudly cursed. Yan Lianqi pursed her lips and remained silent. She quietly got up from the ground, rubbed her bleeding elbow, and still lowered her head. Seeing her with a timid appearance, the woman had more courage and cursed a few times, turning her head back and walking away. A single gaze calmly captured this scene. Yiqin looked at the petite and thin girl outside the car window, her fair face hanging low without too much expression. He only caught a glimpse of the moment when the girl looked up in surprise in the private room, knowing that her beautiful and refined appearance was rare in the world. However, being bullied at will, the girl showed no resistance and even had no expression of sadness. Her clear and beautiful apricot eyes were dull and dull. Such beautiful eyes are a pity. The man withdrew his gaze without any hesitation, raised his hand lightly, and the business car rushed into the upcoming twilight sky. With her head down, Yanxi lifted her eyes and glanced lightly at the disappearing car shadow. Her arms were still bleeding, but she didn't feel anything. Previously, she was most afraid of pain until she met Yiqin. Gradually, she became less afraid and could tolerate his crazy behavior in bed and his sudden onset of illness. Yes, Yiqin used to be sick, he had personality split. It took 2 years of treatment to recover. What is terrifying is that on one hand, his personality is violent, and on the other hand, it is also violent. Whether he is the protagonist or the deputy, whether before or after healing, he is a complete madman. Breathing was almost imperceptible, and Yanxi no longer wanted to think of it. She boarded the bus with a pale face and planned to go home first. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Narrow Roads. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Narrow Roads. Lanxi returned home, feeling the long-lost family affection and the greetings from her parents. She suppressed the tears of longing and couldn't help but give her parents a hug. The couple joked that she still looked like a child, but her throat was sour. She hasn't seen them for almost 4 years. Yiqin has been threatening her to falsely claim to be studying abroad at home. For 4 years, her life was gray and white, with a cold and sealed room, quiet and cold air, and unreachable freedom. There was also that person, who was forced and plundered without escape. At the beginning of the school year, Mo Ran and Lanxi made an appointment to report to the school. The two were close friends from childhood to adulthood, and they both lived up to expectations and received admission letters from prestigious University A. It's just that their majors are different. On the day of the opening ceremony, Yanxi delivered a speech on behalf of the freshman design department. Under the gathering of lights, her smile was clean, and there was a faint excitement and expectation in her heart. Today, she combed her beautiful black hair into a ponytail, revealing her beautiful and delicate features. Even wearing an ordinary white shirt, it was difficult to conceal her inherent temperament. She smiled confidently and talked confidently. A few whistles couldn't help but come from below. She thought that she had avoided the influence of meeting her for the first time on Yiqin, and that she would never meet him again. But sometimes, things in the world can be so unexpected. Just as Lanxi was calmly reciting the climax, his eyes flickered and he suddenly saw the lobby door in the corner suddenly open. There weren't many people coming in, only 4 of them. It wasn't high-profile and didn't have much impact on her surroundings, but it instantly made her lose face. She knew all the men who came in first and turned into ashes. Surprisingly, it's Yiqin. This man is an injustice. She clearly remembers that in the previous life, her speech, Yiqin, was not even here. Or, in the previous life, he was actually there, but she didn't notice him. The man stood indifferent at the entrance of the lobby, his face cold and his eyes pale, appearing somewhat absent-minded. He was followed by several school directors eagerly saying something behind him. Just now at the entrance of the lobby, he vaguely heard a soft and sweet voice, with a whisper like tenderness and a hint of familiarity, which inexplicably made him want to peek. After entering the door, he seemed to notice that the sound in the air suddenly lowered slightly, as if the perfect heavenly sound had been drained of its soul by someone. As if sensing something, he followed the sound and looked towards the stage. The petite girl stood with her spine straight, her eyes drooping, her face pale, and her voice flat and faint, as if mechanically repeating. Like a statue without emotions. With a faint squint in his eyes, he said with an unclear meaning, "Your school has produced many talented people, and it's strange that your speech is so boring." The 3 people behind almost immediately fell silent like cicadas. Several school directors looked at the students on stage who had ruined this hard-earned opportunity, feeling angry. If we convince this person in front of us, the school won't have to worry about a large amount of repair funds. I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Gu. If you're not satisfied, I can ask her to apologize. I'm really sorry. This freshman is the first in her grade, and I don't know why her speech was like this. Not only did he not think of it, but the whole school also did not think of it. Although she had just recited well, the girl on stage suddenly felt like her head was lowered. Yan Lianxi dared not look up at all, facing the various gazes of the crowd, and only read the manuscript on his own. After bowing, he hastily turned around and got off the stage. My heart has turned upside down, both shocked and frightened. She begged God not to let him have any further interest in her. His interests are all harmful to people. Why is he always haunted? However, after the opening ceremony, the principal actually called her to the office. She had a vague premonition in her heart, and sure enough, as soon as she opened the principal's office, she saw that noble and indifferent man. Yiqin sat on the office chair, legs folded, listening to the principal's words beside him, neither affirming nor denying, with a silent and arrogant appearance even more than the host. Amidst the interplay of light and shadow, his face, as beautiful as a heavenly god, became increasingly clear, and the depth in his cold eyes was unfathomable. Seeing her knocking on the door, he just gave her a faint glance and then withdrew his gaze, as if he didn't care at all, without any surprise. Yan Lianxi's heart eased a bit. In the 4 years of her previous life, she knew about his expression and meaning about 70.8%. She knew that he was feeling a little lost at this moment, and he was definitely not interested in her. Yan Lanxi, I called you over today to criticize you. What are you talking about in today's speech? Where is a university? Did you deliver such a speech? It's so terrible, it's really tarnishing our reputation as a university. This old man just started by cursing without hesitation. Yan Lianxi couldn't argue at all, her lips lightly pursed into a line, then quickly loosened. Today, because of your terrible speech, what do others think of us? Go. Write a review, school motto 100 times. Yan Lianxi swallowed her anger and said, if it weren't for Yiqin, this lunatic, how could she have messed up a good speech? I'm sorry, principal. All right, principal, she answered dryly, bowing her head in a submissive manner. Sue was relieved by the scolding, and then saw her scolding and punishing like a ball of cotton. The principal waved his hand and let her out. The girl's stiff figure disappeared from the door, and at this moment, Yiqin's gaze suddenly shifted from the window to the door. The principal, seeing his indifferent and unpredictable expression, spoke cautiously and said, Mr. Gu, we have deeply reflected on this. It is absolutely not appropriate for a university students to have such a phenomenon. Look, the donation for the renovation. Yiqin only casually responded and ignored the immediately smiling principal. His gaze did not leave the door for a long time. His mind couldn't help but imagine the timid and obedient appearance of the young girl just now, inexplicably feeling that the numbness on her face was very eye-catching, and there was always a strange feeling, but he didn't know where to start. Those clear and bright eyes are filled with timidity, boredom, and dullness. Unfortunately, although things are beautiful, they lack some collectible value. With a faint eyebrow raised, the man stood up without any attachment. When the principal saw that the man had a sense of separation, he immediately recognized his gaze and walked forward respectfully to open the door and lead the way for the man. Before leaving, Yiqin left a sentence, after the construction, I will come and inspect again. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Strange. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Strange days passed slowly and smoothly, and in the blink of an eye, a month passed peacefully. Yan Lanxi and Mo Ran are planning to launch their own small clothing studio, and the product cost for a quarter is about 150,000 yuan, and they don't have that much money yet. If you remember correctly, the winner of the upcoming James Fabric Cup Fashion Creative Design Competition will receive a prize of 500,000 yuan. She won't have to worry about not having the startup funds by then. Yan Lanxi never saw Yiqin again. Yes, without that first encounter that piqued his interest, he and she would eventually be two parallel lines, without any intersection. Everything seemed to be developing in a positive direction, but she forgot that things are unpredictable, and even if fate arranges them, some things will be difficult to avoid. On a rest day afternoon, the sunset gradually appeared in the sky, beautiful as if a fairyland had descended. Looking down from the rooftop of a university's teaching building, one can even have a panoramic view of a university. I saw a young girl sitting on the rooftop holding a sketchboard. The gentle breeze brushed against her soft hair, revealing her beautiful and unparalleled fair face. The girl is like a quiet sleeping lotus, with calm and clear eyes focused and serious. The marker in her hand is rapidly revealing an inspiration outline. The design of an evening dress was born, with the hem of the dress flowing like light, and the details being fully drawn. Even the material and texture have been clearly marked. This is not a draft, but a perfect design that only needs to be made into a physical object. This is Sunset, one of the works she designed in her previous life in a dull and quiet life. Those designs are like her children, they were not made public in the previous life, but in this life she must seize her dreams. The sunset has almost disappeared, and night is about to fall. There is a damp and cool atmosphere enveloping the air, indicating that the weather is about to change. After finishing her last stroke, Yan Guoxi put away her things and prepared to leave. Unexpectedly, a gust of strong wind blew the sketchboard in her hand with a clatter, and the design draft was blown away from her fingertips. Yan Guoxi reached out to catch the design draft, which fell into the crack of the door, only a small corner could be seen. Fortunately, it didn't fly away. Yan Lianqi's nervous heart relaxed, and he lifted his leg and walked over, then opened the door and squatted down to pick it up. Her fingertips were only an inch away from the design draft on the ground, but her gaze and movements suddenly froze. Suddenly, a pair of clean and shiny black leather shoes appeared in his gaze. Yan Guoxi recognized at a glance that these were privately customized works by a very famous designer in Milan, and there was a person who had a special fondness for this style. In an instant, her blood froze, and in the air, she could even smell the chilling scent of pine sandalwood. That intuition became increasingly evident, and an instinctive resistance and fear made her pores suddenly erect, pulling her nerves into a string. She dare not look up at all, dare not let him see her. She was about to hastily pick up the design draft, but just as she was momentarily stunned and panicked, a pair of slender jade-like hands had casually picked it up. Yan Lianqi clenched her palm and stood up straight, looking down at the man's leather shoes without even glancing at him. Yiqin lowered his gaze lightly and glanced at the painting in his hand, with a hint of amazement and approval in his eyes. He then shifted his gaze to the girl in front of him who looked timid with her head lowered, with a hint of contemplation in his eyes. The man's indecisive gaze scanned her inch by inch, making Yan Lianqi's heart uneasy and afraid. God knows, she has already avoided his gaze in this lifetime, why would such an unexpected encounter occur? Seeing that the man had been silent for a long time and had no intention of returning the painting to her, Yan Lianqi lost his composure and couldn't help but speak up. Please return my painting to me, Mr. Gu. The calm statement of the young girl made Yiqin's eyes squint slightly, and the man's voice carried a cold smile. You never look up at me, you know who I am. He certainly didn't know, she could even recognize him as a lunatic at a glance when he turned into dust. Yan Lianqi had nothing to say, staring blankly at the ground, his palms facing upwards, waiting for the man to return the painting. Yiqin gazed at the beautiful and elusive face of the young girl, her eyelashes resembling butterfly wings still trembling with unease. Her face was astonishingly white, even though her tone was calm, her face seemed to have seen a ghost. But as I brushed past the slender eyelashes, I could vaguely see a pair of clear and moving eyes. Although they hung low like a lifeless spirit, it was difficult to conceal their brightness. The strange feeling grew stronger, accompanied by a slightly faster heartbeat that had been inactive for many years. Yiqin suddenly lowered his gaze and looked coldly at the girl's upward palm. Without saying a word, he put the painting into the girl's palm and then turned around to leave. He knew that his heart beating faster was not his intention. Such a bland and tasteless woman would never suit his taste. It seems that there is something wrong with his body, starting from the last time he saw this woman. Like a secretive and restless desire, no one knows except in the dark. The man had already left unnoticed, and Yan Lianxi finally breathed a sigh of relief. Her face turned pale as she gazed at the staircase where the man had disappeared, as if she had gone through hell for a moment. Why did Yiqin appear here alone? Is it a coincidence again? It doesn't seem like he's staring at her. If he had, he wouldn't have allowed her to escape at all. In his previous life, he monitored himself like a voyeur for a year. At first, it was called Pursuit, where various high-end jewelry and luxury goods were given as gifts. However, she detested such behavior of a young master and had a bad initial impression of him, so she didn't pay much attention to him. But he didn't expect such behavior to increase his interest even more. Until a year later, when she was 19 years old, this madman began to go crazy and would do anything to win her. It's definitely not like this. After a moment of silence, Yan Lianxi packed up her things and hurriedly returned to the house she and Mo Ran rented. This is a 2-bedroom apartment rented for their convenience in opening an online store, and Yan Lianxi handed over the daily design drafts to Mo Ran. Have you finished designing? She, you are really amazing. Wow, how do I think the clothes you designed are getting better and better. Yan Lianxi couldn't help but raise her lips as she watched Mo Ran's happy and stunning appearance. During the 4 years of being imprisoned by Yiqin, only painting and design could provide her with comfort, which is naturally incomparable to herself 4 years ago. Yan Lianxi couldn't help but caress the fingertips of her right hand, and the cocoons she had developed from neglecting sleep, food, and painting were no longer there. I still remember the appearance of Yiqin getting angry about his crazy painting at that time. Yan Lianxi, you're not going to die, are you? In my memory, the man's eyes were deep like the sea, cold like ice, looking at her haggard appearance due to forgetfulness of sleep and food. Is that how you like to oppose me? Are you lost in front of me like you haven't heard of me? Every day, I only care about your paintings, and you're so unwilling to stay by my side. Thinking of this scene, a mocking smile flashed at the corner of her lips, and in just 1 second, it became plain and traceless. Today is just an accident, and in this lifetime, she doesn't want to have any interaction with him anymore. Retrieving her thoughts, she turned her head to look at Mo Ran, who was holding a design draft and planning for prototyping, accessories, development, and marketing, just short of starting the funding. The notes in a notebook were densely packed, and Yan Zhuxi looked at her with a dazzling starlight in his eyes. We must all strive to become the best person. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Is he? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6 is he. In the golden autumn of October, the National Day holiday has arrived. Like in their previous life, in order to earn credits for activities, Yan Gushi and Mo Ran signed up for the National Day Gala program, where Mo Ran played the piano and danced Yan Gushi. Before the party, due to that unease and vague premonition, Yan Lianxi knew deeply that this life needed to be low-key. Yan Lianxi suddenly changed her mind and wanted to change their program together to a solo by Mo Ran, but because the program list was already prepared, she couldn't make any further changes. The gears of fate turned in an unexpected direction that she was caught off guard against. It's night, in a luxurious villa somewhere. In the cold grey room, the exceptionally handsome man lay on the bed with his eyes closed, his face pale and thin lips tightly pursed, his eyebrows furrowed, and beads of sweat rolling down his forehead. Clearly, it looked like it was haunted by a nightmare. On the bedside table, a bottle of sleeping pills stood still, and the night was so quiet that only the heavy breathing of the man could be heard. Suddenly awakened, the man's eyes were filled with lingering crimson fear. 2 seconds later, his eyes gradually calmed down, becoming deep and indifferent. Like jade stained with ink, his eyes were filled with deep emotions. Tonight, he had a dream, but it was no longer the pitch-black little house and a group of grinning wild dogs from his childhood, but a strange sight. In my dream, the moonlit night is silent, and the moonlight is hazy and beautiful. But there was a woman in a white dress, like a fluttering butterfly, leaping down from the balcony. Who is she? Why did this dream bring him even greater fear than the nightmare he had in his childhood? The pain was as if flesh and blood were being cut off, and the part of the heart seemed to stop beating. His gaze drifted to the sleeping pills by the bedside, and after a moment, he calmly reached out and skillfully swallowed a few pills. No more dreams for a night. On the day of the National Day Gala at a university, students gathered and the outdoor lobby was bustling with activity. On the stage, lights and colorful decorations were displayed, and the fireworks were bright. The night sky was hazy, emitting a sinister unease. Lanxi's nervous gaze swept over the people sitting in the front rows, only to find that there was no familiar figure from memory, which made her feel a little relieved. At this point, the opening ceremony had already begun on stage, and Lanxi was pulled backstage by Mo Ran to prepare for the performance. Next, let's enjoy the ballet, Swan Lake, prepared by the Freshman School of Fashion Design and the Freshman School of Economics. On stage, the lights were dim and pitch black. The next second, a soft and bright beam of light shone in the center of the stage, and the whole audience couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. It's really beautiful. The young girl stood tall and graceful, dressed in a white lace dance dress, revealing her slender neck and skin that was more snowy. She held her waist tightly. She raised her white wrist lightly, with a graceful posture. Her every move was graceful and light, and the smoke and waves flowed on her exquisite and pure little face, with every frown and smile, exuding a stunning beauty. Everyone was suffocated by the beauty of this scene, unable to move their gaze on the graceful dance of the young girl until the dance ended and everyone seemed to wake up from a dream. The whole audience burst into huge applause. In the inconspicuous corner of the crowd, there was a man wearing a black casual outfit, a baseball cap, and a mask, looking at the girl on stage with great interest. I saw him with a carefree and unrestrained posture, with his legs crossed elegantly in a mischievous manner. His baseball cap and mask covered his face well, and only the exquisite and unparalleled jawline could be seen, revealing a pair of eyes that were faintly beautiful. Those eyes were wicked and cold, and gradually a fervent light spread. Lanxi returned to the backstage and wiped the fine sweat from his forehead. Looking down at the audience again, as if feeling uneasy. There were a sea of people in the audience, and there was no familiar figure among the school directors in the first two rows. She finally let go of her worries. You're amazing. The first place this time must be ours. Mo Ran looked surprised and excited. The first place not only earns more credits, but also a bonus, and Mo Ran is extremely happy. Lanxi's performance was very plain, and for some reason, she always felt an ominous premonition. Momo, if you wait for the nomination and award, you can go up. I have something else to do, the design draft is still a bit short, so I'll go back first. Alright, workaholic, go ahead and I'll nominate you for good news later. Lanxi smiled and turned around, changed his clothes, and left here. Leaving the lobby, it was late at night with heavy dew. Guaxi wrapped her clothes tightly and left along the path, but suddenly stopped her pace. Just because there was a person standing in front of her, she easily blocked her path. The night was heavy, and there was no doubt that this person was a man, wearing loose casual clothes with a corner of a mask leaking from the pocket of his pants. The man is tall and dressed in ordinary clothes, but he vaguely exudes extraordinary qualities. He was twirling a cigarette with his fingertips, his head lowered, blocking the path, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Under night blindness, she squinted her eyes to suppress the fear in her heart and looked at the man's face. As he was smoking with his head down, his cold and slender fingers exuded an elegant and unrestrained movement, but for some reason, a sense of familiarity. Her toes couldn't resist a slight movement, and she turned around and walked away. But the man followed her to this point. How could he be willing to let her go like this? Lanxi saw an arm forcefully blocking in front of her. Excuse me, excuse me. She pretended to be calm and spoke, but Yu Guang still couldn't see the man's face clearly. But there was a faint mint scent in the air, some of which were terrifyingly familiar. But in just 1 second, she overturned the possibility that popped up in her heart. Impossible, time has clearly not arrived. Upon hearing this, the man's movements seemed to stagnate. He lifted his head and locked her tightly with an indescribable gaze. Seeing her head lowered, he suddenly let out a soft hiss and couldn't help but lightly lick the corner of his lips. Even the voice is really his mother nice. The girl pretended to be calm and trembling, so much so that her voice was trembling, a bit sweet and soft, and also pretended to be calm. It's a bit interesting. What's your name? By the ear, a man's voice with a faint smile and a nonchalant tone sounded, unquestionably domineering and irresistible. But it made her like a bolt from the blue. She turned her head to look at the man's face, feeling shocked and panicked the next second. Through the layers of thin gauze like night, this time she could see clearly the general appearance of the man. This is a breathtaking face, with thin lips and starry eyes, without any imperfections. This is clearly Yiqin's face. No, holding back the fear and trembling in her heart, it was still evident that the man was still staring at her tightly. The perfect and passionate peach blossom-shaped eyes gave the illusion of being focused and passionate, but those eyes were sinister, cold and wild, with a hint of fanaticism, and their gaze carried an irresistible and domineering aura. He is not Yiqin at all. He is Lingchen. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Ling Chen. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Ling Chen. She tried her best to maintain calmness on her face, but her complexion was as pale as paper. The moment of shock that flashed through her pupils did not escape the man's eyes. He squinted his eyes slightly and looked around at her, suddenly evoking a faint smile. What, do you know me? Lanxi took a sip of the cold air in the air, his voice uncontrollably trembling. Mr. Gu, who is well known, has had several connections and naturally remembers. The man remained non-committal, and the slender eyelashes of crow-black trembled in the night, with a seemingly inexplicable glint in his pupils. He gracefully lowered his head and took a puff of smoke, his evil cold eyes unable to see clearly behind the smoke. There was a moment of eerie silence in the atmosphere, and Lanxi felt the indistinguishable gaze piercing her back, frantically wanting to escape. Just as she was trying to find an excuse to leave, a breath of tobacco, accompanied by a refreshing cold fragrance, struck, posing an indescribable danger. Startled and frightened, he suddenly stepped back and pressed forward step by step. The man's eyes shone like stars in the deep night, unable to see clearly the expression in his eyes. He could only distinguish that his eyes were even more transparent and dazzling than obsidian, overlapping with a certain scene in her memory. The fear in the girl's eyes was obvious, and the man's eyebrows seemed slightly raised, stopping there. He lowered his gaze and glanced at the pin on her chest, which read, Yan Guaxi, freshman art student. There is a beautiful woman who never forgets when you see her. Yan Guaxi, the man's voice was tinged with a faint smile, but it was like a gentle breeze brushing past, with a hint of lingering charm. That's a very pleasant name to hear. She dared not take a breath and only looked up at the slightly curved peach blossom eyes of the man. Her smile was unusually passionate, but it exuded a sense of alienation and indifference. She looked exceptionally talkative, but she knew very well that he and Yiqin were of the same kind. I cannot tolerate any disobedience, resistance, or refusal. At this moment, the ringtone of his phone in his pocket suddenly rang, and his expression suddenly faded. His pitch-black eyes lowered their heads to glance at the watch between his wrists, and his eyebrows furrowed slightly. What a pity, time is running out. The man raised his delicate eyebrows and eyes, with a slightly cold expression that exuded an evil aura. He turned around and prepared to leave, taking 2 steps but then turning back. "I forgot to tell you, my name is Ling, the man said, and his lips curved slightly. "Looking forward to our next meeting." The man's figure has disappeared into the night, but it has made her heart sink infinitely. She wanted her heart to permanently sink into this deep and cold night. She dodged Yiqin, but failed to dodge Ling. Why did Ling appear so early and immediately set his sights on her? Did the scorching gaze on stage just now come from him? Why did Ling appear 2 years earlier? Is avoiding really useless? Just like a strange fate, she is destined to never escape in this lifetime. Ling Lianqi's face turned pale, and she gently closed her eyes. Memories flashed through countless fragmented paragraphs in an instant. There is a beautiful woman who never forgets when she sees her. In my memory, there was a gentle murmur from a man, with a hint of evil in his stunning peach blossom eyes, exuding a demonic charm, yet his gaze was hot and crazy. "He can give it to you, so can I. Why don't you take a look at me?" The agony in his shattered eyes was his cold approach to her face, forcing her to question. "I will destroy him and completely own you, Xiaoxi." Ling gently drugged her wrist, which had been injured due to being imprisoned, with a hint of malice in her cool tone. "In my memory, who is crying again? Despair and desolation, humbly pleading. Please, help me, let me go. Xiaoxi, you know well that I can't bear to part with you. If I let you go, you will forever leave my sight." The gaze that belonged exclusively to Ling, with a hint of pity, but with a determined determination to win. "Farewell, Xiaoxi." In her sleep, who was wiping her tears, her voice filled with unbearable pain. That was the last time Ling appeared. Thinking about this, Lianqi gritted his teeth tightly. In my mind, there are 2 the first mock examination faces, but different eyes. The incident between Yiqin and Ling was shattered and swayed in her mind. The appearance of Ling further drove Yiqin insane. The disappearance of Ling, although it made Yiqin no longer as happy and angry as difficult to distinguish. For her, there was no longer the same coercion as before. He untied her chains, but still imprisoned her, often probing her with complex eyes late at night. He has become easy to talk about and will also treat her gently. But his personality became increasingly difficult to predict. He became impeccable, making her feel even more that his occasional kindness and gentleness towards her were just his new way of playing. The night was heavy, and Zhuxi stood stiffly for a while before dragging his body away with cold sweat and sweat. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Refusal. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8 Refusal. After Ling's sudden appearance that night, Lanxi had not seen this person again for a period of time. Like a shallow ripple appearing out of thin air, she was well aware of the turbulent crisis hidden beneath the calm lake surface. If Yiqin is the shackle of Lanxi, then Ling is her calamity. Half a life's good fortune and misfortune arise from these 2 people. No, from a certain perspective, they are already the same person. In the previous life, Ling fell in love with her at first sight and engaged in a crazy entanglement with her. The love of a young man is hot and deep, yet he burns everything without considering the consequences. Perhaps in this life, the gears of fate are turning uncontrollably, but perhaps unlike in the previous life, Yiqin has not yet set his sights on her. Perhaps it's not too bad yet. The girl was full of worries, and her fingertips unconsciously marked a deep mark on the design draft. When she came to her senses, the paper had been crumpled by herself and thrown into the nearby trash can. This is the draft she is preparing to participate in the recent James Fabric Cup Fashion Creative Design Competition. In her previous life, she won 2nd place, and in this life, she is confident that she can still achieve the same place without the inspiration from her previous life. As it was getting late, all the drafts were put away. Zhuxi was about to leave the rooftop, but when she turned around, she saw a familiar figure standing quietly not far or near, silently observing her. Her hand trembled uncontrollably. How can it be like a ghost? Why is this person here? Facing the faint glow, perhaps wanting to distinguish which personality the person in front of her was, the girl's gaze lightly scanned the man's face, and after glimpsing the cold and calm between the noble man's eyebrows and eyes, she had an answer in her heart. Yiqin silently looked at the young girl. He had been standing behind her for 2 minutes, and there was no need for him to intervene in the affairs here. However, there seemed to be a strange desire in his heart that made him come to a university. He knew that he had appeared before a university, so he wanted to explore what he did here. I didn't expect that the rooftop, which I wanted to meditate on during my college years, would also be the territory she often frequented. The girl only stared at him for a second before lowering her head, looking hesitant and at a loss. "Hello, Mr. Gu." Even with a low voice, like a cat. Whispered in response. For some reason, he suddenly felt a bit thirsty. The strange impulse in his heart invaded again, as if something was dividing into independent emotions in his chest. He was convinced that that passionate emotion could not belong to him. The man pursed his thin lips, his cold and indifferent eyebrows making him even more indifferent and indifferent. The girl lowered her head and stood not far from her, dull and uninteresting. Apart from her beautiful face, it was hard to find anything special. But he has a talent that he has to focus on. "What's your name?" After a moment of silence, he suddenly spoke. Lanxi felt a little relaxed upon hearing this. He had seen her several times, but he didn't remember her name, which meant he had no interest in her at all. Facing the curious gaze, I didn't know what the man meant. Guashi pinched his wet palm and answered softly. Lanxi. "You have a natural talent for design," Yiqin said in a lukewarm tone. "Thank you for your praise." Unable to figure out his intentions, Lanxi's whole body was like a piercing needle, and she cautiously responded to it, feeling very nervous in her heart. "Are you interested in serving as the chief designer of Gu's group?" He rubbed the turbine of his lighter in the palm of his hand and lit a cigarette, speaking calmly. Lanxi was stunned. She seemed somewhat surprised because in her previous life, there was no such thing. The Prada International Painting Competition at the age of 19 was her last work to face the world. She remembered that it was a moment of his kindness towards her. He allowed her to prove herself, but never allowed her to study abroad, let alone escape his grasp. Later on, perhaps a month before she committed suicide, he suddenly mentioned that he wanted to help her realize her dream, and he was planning to use a large amount of money to create her own brand. With just the design drawings, he could make such a brand active in the market. He also said he would hold an art exhibition for her. But she refused. She disdains living under his self-proclaimed wings, knowing that it is like a sweet date dipped in poison, and it does not truly belong to her. Besides, freedom is gone, talk about dreams. Recalling this, she suddenly realized that the man was still staring at her, with a hint of exploration in his eyes. After the smoke wrapped around him, his eyes were cold and blurry. She bit her tongue and whispered, "I'm sorry, Mr. Gu. I don't have any intention in this area at the moment. I just want to study hard now. It's not too late to refuse after thinking it over. Gu can guarantee that your design will be recognized by the world." After being rejected, a hint of darkness flashed in Yiqin's eyes, as if he couldn't understand why she refused. Who wouldn't want to collaborate with Gu? Jushi is very confident that he has the capital to promote her works, and her design, combined with Gu's market influence, is undoubtedly an excellent opportunity. But she was determined that she could never have any involvement with him in this life. "Sorry, Mr. Gu," she said with a low brow. The tone was distant and polite, but it made Yiqin squint slightly in an instant. Watching her low eyebrows and contented expression, he felt inexplicably frustrated. His fingers loosened his tie, and his eyes flashed with sharpness. Miss Yen, are you afraid of me? The man's cold eyebrows slightly raised, and a hint of cunning suddenly appeared, but his voice remained extremely cold. Or are you hiding from me? Hearing the man's sudden cold inquiry, clearly without any questioning tone, made her heart thump. She instinctively looked up at him and caught a glimpse of the man's sharp clear eyes and a hint of cunning between his eyebrows, causing her heart to jump. This expression is very similar to Gu Lingqian's. In a sense, they are really one person. Extremely similar is also normal. Her body stiffened for a moment, and she didn't escape the man's eyes. Gu Yiqin just casually said it, but what he said was true. This intuition, which belonged solely to him, was confirmed at this moment. Yes. Gu Yiqin finally understood the series of strange feelings in his heart. It was she who was afraid of him and even wanted to avoid him. Last time she happened to meet on the rooftop, her face turned pale. She was not surprised by his appearance, but rather afraid. But they clearly don't know each other. But if that first encounter scared her, it makes sense. The man glanced at her lightly and caught a glimpse of her suddenly trembling eyelashes, with a pale and cautious expression that inexplicably caught the eye. The mood is waning. You have a lot of time to think, you can contact me when you think about it. His voice cooled down, and he suddenly reached out to her, making her face suddenly turn a little pale while she was still pondering. He felt lost as if he hadn't heard it before, and quickly took out the pen from her hand. He raised his hand and wrote a string of numbers on the blank white paper in her hand. Then, without saying a word, she handed her the pen in her hand and instinctively caught it. When she looked up again, she could only see the cold figure of the man leaving without any attachment. In an instant, she gradually regained consciousness, feeling only a false alarm. The faint coldness that flashed in the man's eyes just now was caught by her. Perhaps following him, not resisting him, will not attract his attention. Especially her timid appearance, he seemed very disgusted. She pinched the pen in her palm, as if there was still the warmth and breath of a man's palm on it. She threw the pen into her backpack like a hot potato. After getting off the teaching building, she pursed her lips again and looked at the trash can on the roadside. She didn't know what she remembered, but then took out the pen that had been used by the man from her backpack and threw it into the trash can along with the paper with the number left by the man. After throwing it away, she seemed to have some relief. She raised her eyebrows recklessly and turned her head gracefully to leave. But she was unaware that behind a strong and dense tree not far away, a proud figure was casually smoking, and everything the girl did was shattered. At dusk, the halo left a flowing light shadow in the man's pupils, and the dark ink dyed it with a heart-stirring amber color, like transparent and unparalleled glass beads, but condensed with a cold feeling. He casually inserted his hand into his pocket and threw 1/3 of the cigarette he had smoked into the trash can with the other hand. Then he glanced at the girl's disappearing figure, but after a while, he chuckled softly. Elegantly flicking the non-existent dust off the hem of his clothes, the man turned around and left with a cold expression on his face. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Competition. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9 Competition. After day and night of deliberation and accumulation of inspiration, Lanxi's entries were finally completed. She submitted her works to the official email of the design competition, and her confident and bright eyes had a hint of real laughter. The night when the ranking was announced undoubtedly amazed the fashion design industry. I saw that among the top 10 ranked individuals in the industry, they were all highly acclaimed individuals. The second place was the renowned talent of a university, Yan Xinyu, who was widely recognized as a genius in painting. But the first place was actually a completely unfamiliar name. Qingyi. As is well known, the James Fabric Cup is the most prestigious competition in China, and the judges are famous figures both domestically and internationally. They hold a significant position and influence in this circle, and there is no other possibility of cheating. However, the first place winner, who does not know his true name, age, or gender, stated that he will not appear publicly at the award ceremony due to personal reasons and requested the organizers to keep all personal information confidential. For a while, a well-known domestic fashion magazine published Surprise Mysterious Genius Designer Chingy, and the entries left by this mysterious designer also occupied the covers of major fashion magazines and excellent design books. At the moment when Yan Jushi received a prize of 500,000 yuan, he and Mo Ran started their own clothing studio plan. The starting capital was 150,000 yuan, and she lent Mo Ran 75,000 yuan. The two of them were full of ambition, and Mo Ran immediately went to work on the production of plate accessories. A spacious and low-luxury office that is quiet, clear, and audible. The man sat at his desk in a suit and leather shoes, his slender legs casually overlapping. His handsome and unformed features were like a dream under the halo, and his fair skin made him look somewhat refined. His slender and perfect subordinate was a fashion magazine, and the open side was prominently displaying the recent events that have stirred up the fashion industry. His index finger lightly tapped on the table, and his cold eyes couldn't distinguish between joy and anger. His gaze drifted to the stunning entries in the magazine. The Rebirth series. The thick, absurd and gorgeous black, like a heavy black night, exudes desolation, despair, and a desperate beauty. As the hem of the skirt extended towards the ground, it seemed as if there was no shining light, like a hopeless struggling hell, unable to wait for any redemption. However, right at the lifeless hem of the skirt, in a dreamlike world of gauze and non-gauze, there were blood-colored dark lines slowly spreading, until a Manju Sha Hua appeared at the hem, embroidered lifelike and astonishingly dazzling, capturing people's hearts. The flaunting and fragile flower extends straight up from the hem of the skirt, called despair by those who cannot understand, and hope by those who understand. It is for rebirth. It was indeed stunning, so stunning that he only wanted to admire it, and he had a deep understanding of this mysterious designer. Such a work, without going through human affairs, could never have been designed. And with such talent and spiritual energy, the details are handled so delicately, which can be called seasoned. He guessed that the other party should be a woman in her 30s and 40s. Gu Yiqin calmly closed the fashion magazine and then made a phone call. With power in hand, there are no secrets in this world. Hello, Mr. Gu. The person on the other end of the phone was very respectful. Upon hearing Gu Yiqin's request, they hesitated for a moment before sending the information to Gu Yiqin's email. Hanging up the phone, Gu Yiqin opened his email and saw the email he had just sent. Opening the attachment, even though he remained calm like him, a hint of surprise flashed between his eyebrows and eyes, surprisingly. It's her. No wonder he always felt that the skirt in the rendering of the work had a familiar style, with a particular love for swaying dress skirts that seemed to match the style of the design draft he took a quick glance at on the rooftop last time. However, this rebirth is more storytelling, carrying two deep and complicated emotions. He was unable to connect such a stunning and perfect work with a college student who had not yet graduated. Yan Guaxi. How many more surprises can you give me? Gu Yiqin suddenly remembered that she always looked down, cautious, and without any temper in front of him, occasionally showing a hint of fear that he couldn't hide in time. But even though she was afraid of him, she decisively refused him, as if avoiding a plague, and she was too afraid of him. The man chuckled coldly, with a hint of interest in the curve of his lips. His cold eyes were filled with a hint of playfulness, as if he was curious about something. He didn't forget the appearance of her throwing his used pen and contact information into the trash can without hesitation when teaching downstairs that day. He now seemed to vaguely remember the moment when she seemed to lift her eyebrows and release her anger. Such vivid colors unexpectedly filled her clear eyes, like the pure first snow of winter. He had witnessed a sly smile on her lips at that time. And which scene? Is she the real one? My eyes slowly became calm and indifferent, and my fingertips slowly tapped on the table. After a moment, I handed the competition information to my assistant. No matter what conditions are used, sign her as the chief designer of Gu's company. Gu Yiqin's voice was faint on the phone, and his tone could not be ignored. Okay, Mr. Gu. Assistant Yun Qing was a bit surprised, and Mr. Gu personally named the person he wanted to stay, which was an extremely rare situation. Opening my email, I found out that it was actually a college student. What surprised him even more was that the logo and notes in the bottom right corner of this information clearly stated that this young girl was actually the recently famous Qin Yi in the fashion industry. Upon receiving the invitation call from the Gu group, Yan Jushi was momentarily surprised, and then gradually understood that Gu Yiqin had immense power, and it didn't take much trouble to search for a small designer. Still using the same excuses as before, she made it clear that she only wanted to study hard and not consider anything else for the time being. She remained calm and unmoved, regardless of the other party's various exciting conditions. After hanging up the phone, she leaned her elbow and focused for a moment before flipping out a phone number from her address book and dialing it over. The phone was connected in 2 seconds, and there came a voice from across the street that was both official and implicit in excitement. Miss Yen, have you agreed? Tell your boss to talk to me. At 3 p.m., it's Starbucks downstairs from your company. Okay, please wait a moment. I need to ask our CEO for his opinion. After more than a minute, the other person said, Hello, Miss Yen, Mr. Su said we have time. Yan Jushi responded lightly and politely said goodbye before both parties hung up the phone. Yan Lianqi understands very clearly that money and career can give people a sense of security. She needs to make up for things and attempts that she has never had in her previous life. Because she has no power, or money, in her previous life she was like a doe being kneaded and slaughtered by Gu Yiqin. This life is different. She wants to live her own life and no longer be controlled by anyone. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Cooperation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10 Cooperation. Starbucks. A gust of wind chimes suddenly rang outside the door, carrying a refreshing breeze. Upon hearing the sound, Su Rui looked up and collided with a pair of sparkling, glass bead-like eyes. The young girl's eyebrows and eyes were still immature, and her clear and beautiful face showed a hint of indifference that did not belong to her age, which made even the countless beauties he had seen lose their composure. After looking around, the girl locked her gaze on him, which made him subconsciously feel a bit nervous. She looks much better than the photo in the identification photo, and that beauty lies not in her appearance, but in her aura. Yes, aura, an unmarried student. He could feel the elegance and nobility emanating from her bones. This kind of aura is difficult to form if it is heavily influenced by the environment for a long time. Thinking of that Rebirth series of works, he became even more incredible. What kind of person is she, even though she is just an ordinary scholarly family, with a warm family and a flower-like age? What kind of story did she go through to design such a heavy work? Sorry for the long wait. The voice flows like a clear spring, with a gentle and clear tone. He saw her sitting down in front of him, calmly ordering a cup of American coffee, and then slowly looking at him, without any stage fright of just entering society. Miss Yen is a bit different from what I imagined, the handsome man said, politely smiling at her. Just call me Qingyi. She smiled, her words being calm and business-oriented. Mr. Su should know the purpose of my trip, so I'll get straight to the point. Her uncompromising attitude surprised him a bit, and he nodded lightly to signal her but said it was okay. Your assistant has already communicated with me and I have no objections. But to be honest, I have already started planning to open my own clothing studio. What do you mean? Su Rui waited quietly for her next message. Yan Jushi smiled and said, This studio only sells popular style clothing. I won't disclose to the public that the designer is me. And I won't use the name of Qin Yi to promote or use the reputation of the Su family to attract traffic to my studio. She didn't have these plans at all. It doesn't matter. Su Rui smiled gently and quickly understood her meaning. Do you want to only sign your high.end series with Su Shi? Yan Yanxi nodded and said, yes, I will guarantee that during the 5-year contract period, I will not design high.end collections for any commercial purposes for any clothing design companies other than Su. However, my clothing design for the public and any entries are not related to Su. The copyright of the entries belongs to me personally, and of course, I will not sell the entries to companies other than Su, at least for these 5 years. The meaning is that if Su wants to buy my entries, he will have to pay extra. Su Rui nodded in agreement. Do you have any further requirements? Additionally, I hope that Mr. Su will keep my identity confidential. You need to ensure that no one, except your personal assistant and you, knows who is serving as the chief designer of your company. My name and intentions are not acceptable. Although Su Rui didn't know why she was so persistent in concealing her identity, and if it weren't for this James Fabric, where he was the organizer, he would have had to go through a lot of trouble to determine who Qin Yi was. But he's not someone who talks too much out of curiosity. He just nodded in agreement and said, Miss Qingyi, please rest assured that you only need to produce high-quality design drafts. Just send them to my email every time. If you need an interview, you can make a private appointment in advance, and no one will know who the designer is. Yan Zhuxi nodded slightly. It's just that we always need a name to name ourselves, Su Rui said. Then let's write Ashley. After all, no one will know her. Yan Zhuxi pondered for a moment. Su Rui nodded and said, so that's the decision. Tomorrow, I will have my assistant draft a contract and send it to you. Yan Zhuxi stood up, curled his lips and extended his hand. So the cooperation is pleasant, Mr. Su. Su Rui caught a glimpse of the brilliant light in her eyes, lost his composure for a moment, and then stood up and extended his hand. Happy cooperation, Miss Qingyi, he said. After both parties had discussed all the matters, Yan Zhuxi returned to school and began preparing for the work that Su Rui had entrusted to her. Due to the confidentiality of her identity throughout the entire process, she did not have a team and was the only one to undertake the entire series of design tasks. Of course, her interests were also considerable. Although Su's company may not be as competitive as Gu's, its development scale is also very grand. Clothing is a new industry that Su has entered, which is related to the first battle of Su's group in the clothing commercial sector. Yan Zhuxi is bound to impress everyone at this quarter's new product launch event. October arrived as scheduled, but due to an accident on the rooftop that day, she dared not go to the place where she often captures inspiration. She took a leave alone, preparing to visit her grandmother in the countryside and search for creative inspiration. A rural town with an exotic and rustic atmosphere, the people here are warm and hospitable, with rows of small houses, white walls and red tiles, and a cool breeze carrying a faint scent of pine and orchid, stubbornly lingering around the nose. The most famous one in a town is the orchids here. In October and autumn, the air is clear and refreshing. At the junction of the mountains and the sky, wild orchids are everywhere, with a sweet fragrance. Yan Lanxi noticed a seemingly unremarkable shop selling orchids on the roadside, with a pot of fine-leaved cold orchids placed next to the transparent display window. She couldn't help but approach the shop window to look. She carefully observed that the petals of the fine-leaved orchid had white edges, appearing very fresh and beautiful. The fine-leaved hanlon, which has been artificially domesticated, is even more beautiful and precious. Obviously, this pot is a carefully cultivated hanlon. She walked into the store, but there was no one inside, possibly the innermost part. The fragrance of orchids rushed towards me, and the fragrance of cold orchids seemed to be absent in it. Cold and fragrant, graceful and graceful, she whispered. Cold orchids are not fragrant without anyone. Clear and elegant. Yan Lanxi held a sketchbook in one hand and rubbed the paintbrush in the other. A flash of inspiration flashed through her mind. I have it. She smiled and walked towards the flower shop, shouting, "Is anyone there?" A gentle breeze passed through the shop windows and flower shops, and the rich scent in the air became even more intoxicating. In no time, she saw a lounge chair at the corner, on which lay an old man in his 40s or 50s, dressed in a simple gray sweater, with a bamboo-woven straw hat covering his face. The bright sunlight shone on the bamboo chair. Seemingly sensing someone approaching, the bamboo-woven straw hat moved a corner and Yen Zhuxi saw a 3-centimeter scar on the middle-aged man's face. The face, which should have been kind and benevolent, was added a touch of terrifying cruelty by this scar. The middle-aged man squinted his eyes and sat up. He saw a little girl who looked cute and didn't like her face. He was afraid that his fierce appearance would scare the customers, so he immediately smiled a bit. "Does the little girl want to buy flowers?" He felt his voice was relatively soft. "I want to ask. Can I draw a picture of the cold orchid next to the storefront window?" She hesitated and said, "It won't go to waste. I can pay for it. Because if it's a purchase, I definitely can't afford it, it's too expensive. To be honest, because this orchid has given me a lot of inspiration, can I use the pattern I drew on it in my work? If you want to charge, it's also possible." The middle-aged man looked at this little girl dressed like she was from out of town, and his beautiful eyes were filled with his sincerity and starlight that could not be ignored. Suddenly, he smiled happily. "I can agree to your request, and I won't charge you a penny." Lanxi was very surprised when she heard this. She looked at the scar on her uncle's face and felt cute, but she still said, "No, no, no, because I want to draw the pattern to be lifelike and restore the posture of the orchid 100%. This means that I want to use the posture and shape of your orchid completely without any difference in my pattern. You don't charge me, how can I do this? What's going on here? Girl, just draw it." To be honest, this cold orchid was gifted to me by a noble person 2 days ago. There aren't many people who understand orchids, and you're the first one to see its extraordinary quality at a glance. I see. You and it are destined to be together. He smiled and then stood up and walked to the showcase window, picking up the pot of orchids and placing them on the windowsill next to the bamboo chair. Under the sunshine, the cold orchid has an ancient and fragrant color, with beautiful flowers and leaves. After blooming, it is graceful and elegant, and its charm is undoubtedly one of the best in the national orchid. Lanxi noticed that the pots of this Hanlin were not simple either. In her previous life, although she was imprisoned in darkness, Yiqin would often search for rare antiques, precious calligraphy in paintings, exquisite carved jade pieces, ceramic jade objects, and countless jewelry from all over the world, just to make her smile. Because of these, she suddenly realized that the flower pot was actually a purple clay flower pot, facing the light. She suspected that she had glanced away. "Your flower pot," she hesitated to speak. "Oh, this flower pot has landscape paintings on it, and even a handicraft can give me a feeling of being a masterpiece. You think the person who gave me this gift should be so meticulous?" Lanxi fell silent. "That's true. The person who gave this potted flower should have such a big hand, so nitpicking and pursuing perfection. If she told uncle that this pot is several times more expensive than flowers, he probably wouldn't believe it." End of this chapter.